The wind in northern Montana doesn't just blow. It carves. It finds the gaps in your spirit and settles there like ice. Silas Thorne knew that wind. He'd lived with it for 15 years on a patch of dirt that the rest of the world had forgotten. He was a man of 60, with skin like cured leather and hands that didn't shake, even when the winter wolves howled right outside his door. Silas liked the silence. Silence didn't lie. Silence didn't ask for things he couldn't give. He was in the barn, oiling a piece of tack by the light of a single lantern, when the world changed. It wasn't a loud change. It was the sound of a footfall that didn't belong to a horse. A soft, stumbling drag against the frozen grit of a yard. Silas reached for the Winchester, leaning against the grain bin. He didn't leave it. Not yet. He just waited. The door creaked, protesting the cold, and she fell in. She wasn't a woman of the plains. You could tell by the fabric. It was silk, once blue, now stained the color of a bruised plum. She wasn't wearing a coat. Just that thin, torn dress and a pair of indoor slippers that had been shredded by the rocks. Her face was a map of terror. Her breath came in ragged, shallow hitches that rattled in her chest. She saw Silas, saw the rifle, and she didn't scream. She didn't have the strength left for a scream. She lunged forward, grasping the rough wool of his sleeve with fingers that were blue from the frost. "Don't tell my husband I'm here," she whispered. The words were barely a ghost of a sound. "Please, he's coming. Don't tell him." Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp. Silas Thorne stood there for a long heartbeat. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and old coffee. It was warm, but the warmth seemed to make her shiver harder. He didn't put her on the bed. Not yet. He walked to the center of the room, kicked back the heavy bearskin rug, and pulled the iron ring of the root cellar door. It was a dark hole, smelling of damp earth and stored potatoes. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden. Her eyes snapped open, green, like the moss on a shaded creek bed, but clouded with pain. "Listen to me," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "If you want to stay hidden, you go down there. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" She nodded, her teeth chattering so hard he thought they might break. He helped her down the ladder. He handed her a heavy wool blanket and a canteen of water. Then he shut the door. He rolled the rug back. He moved his heavy oak table over the spot. He sat down at that table. He lit a candle. He took out his whetstone and his hunting knife. He began to work the blade. Shoohk, shoohk. The sound was a heartbeat. He waited. An hour passed. The fire in the stove flickered, throwing long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Then he heard it, the rhythmic thud of multiple horses. Not one, 4, maybe 5. They were riding hard, but they slowed as they reached the perimeter of his fence. They knew someone lived here. Silas didn't move. He kept sharpening the knife. The riders stopped in the yard. Leather groaned. Bits clinked. A man's voice called out. A voice that sounded like it was used to giving orders and having them follow without question. "Hello, the house." Silas stood up. He picked up his Winchester. He didn't hide it. Out here, a man without a gun was a man who wanted to die. He stepped onto the porch. The man in the lead was dressed in a coat of fine black wool. His hat was crisp. His horse was a thoroughbred, out of place in this rugged terrain. But it was the badge on his chest that caught the light of Silas's lantern. A U.S. Marshal. But Silas didn't look at the badge. He looked at the man's face. And that's when the iron in Silas's blood turned to lead. He knew this man. He'd served under him in the war. Colonel Vane, the hero of Malpaso. A man celebrated in the papers as a pillar of justice. A man named Silas had ordered the burning of a village because he didn't like the way the wind was blowing. "Silas," Vane said, squinting through the dark. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Silas Thorne? Is that you, you old fox?" "It's me, Julian," Silas said. He didn't lower the rifle. "You're a long way from the circuit courts." "I'm hunting a thief, Silas," Vane said. He dismounted, his movements graceful and arrogant. The men behind him stayed on their horses. They were deputies in name, But Silas knew the look of hired killers when he saw them. A very personal thief. She took something of mine. Something she had no right to. I live alone, Julian. You know that. Just me and the wolves. Vane walked up the steps. He didn't ask permission. He stopped just inches from the end of Silas's rifle. He smelled of expensive tobacco and something else. Something sharp and chemical. She's my wife, Silas, Vane whispered, his voice dropping to a confidential hiss. Clara, she's had a mental break. She ran off in the middle of the night. She's carrying a fever. If I don't find her, she'll die in this cold. You haven't seen a woman in a blue dress, have you? Silas looked Vane in the eye. He saw the hero. He saw the Marshal. But behind his eyes, he saw the monster he'd known 20 years ago. The kind of man who viewed a wife not as a partner, but as a piece of property, a horse to be broken, a dog to be kenneled. Nobody's been here, Julian, Silas said. The lie felt like grit in his mouth. Vane looked at the door. He looked at the mud on the porch. He looked at the way Silas was holding the Winchester. You were always a terrible liar, Silas, even in the cavalry. You'd blink every time you tried to hide a bottle of rye from the quartermaster. Vane stepped closer, his voice turning to ice. Step aside. I want to see my house. This isn't your house, Silas said. This is mine, and you don't have a warrant for a ghost. Vane chuckled. It was a dry, hollow sound. I am the law in this territory, Silas. I don't need a warrant to find my own property. Now, let's not make this like the old days. I'd hate to have to burn this cabin down with you inside it. Silas didn't move. Inside, beneath the floorboards, he knew Clara was listening. He knew she was shivering in the dark, hearing the voice of the man she'd risked her life to escape. But here's the thing about men like Silas Thorne. They spend their lives trying to forget the violence they've seen. They bury it deep before we see what Silas does next. I want to ask you something. If you're still here listening to this story, it's because you know that out here, the law and justice aren't always the same thing. You know that sometimes a badge is just a shield for a bully. If you believe that a man's home is his fortress, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment and tell me, where are you listening from? Are you in a place where the wind bites? Or are you somewhere warm? Let me know. It helps the story grow. Now, back to the porch. Vane's men were moving now, spread out in a semicircle. 4 of them, all armed. Silas was one man with an old Winchester and a knife. The math didn't look good. Last chance, Silas, Vane said. He reached for his holster. Not fast. He was savoring this. He liked the power. Give her to me, and I'll leave you enough of this cabin to sleep in tonight. Silas Thorne took a breath. He felt the cold air fill his lungs. He felt the weight of the rifle. I remember Tennessee, Julian, Silas said quietly. I remember what you did to those people at the river. I didn't say anything then. I was young. I was scared. I've carried that silence for 20 years. It's heavy. It's really heavy. Vane's eyes narrowed. That was war, Silas. No, Silas said. That was murder. And I'm done being silent. Silas didn't aim the rifle at Vane. He fired a shot into the dirt between Vane's feet. The roar of the Winchester shattered the night. Vane's horse reared, whinnying in terror, throwing the yard into chaos. Get him. Vane screamed, scrambling back toward the steps. Silas dug behind a stack of cordwood on the porch. Bullets began to chew into the logs. Fwop, fwop, fwop. Splinters sprayed like needles. Silas leveled the Winchester. He wasn't a young man, but he'd spent 15 years hunting meat to survive. He didn't miss. The first deputy, a man with a scarred face and a double barrel, took a round to the shoulder and spun into the mud. The second one tried to find cover behind a water trough, but Silas caught him as he moved. The yard turned into a nightmare of smoke and muzzle flashes. Silas worked the lever. Crank slide. Fire. Crank slide. Fire. He was a machine now. He wasn't Silas the rancher. He was Thorne the scout. But Vane was smart. He'd circled around the back. Silas heard the window shatter in the Clara. Vane's voice echoed from inside. I know you're in here, you little bitch. I can smell your fear. Silas felt a spike of cold terror. He ignored the men in the yard and lunged through the front door. The cabin was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the stove. Vane was standing in the middle of the room, his revolver drawn. He'd kicked over the table. He was standing right on top of the bearskin rug. I found the door, Silas, Vane said, his voice trembling with a sick kind of joy. I found her whole. He pointed the revolver at the floor, right where Clara's head would be. Throw down the rifle. Vane ordered, or I'll send a bullet down to say hello to her. Silas let the Winchester slide from his fingers. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. That's better, Vane said. He looked at Silas, his face twisted with malice. You always were a sentimental fool. You think you're saving her? You're just making it worse. When I get her back to the city, she'll wish she'd died in the snow. Vane reached down with his free hand to grab the iron ring of the cellar door. He was gloating. He wanted Silas to watch him drag her out. But Vane forgot one thing. The cellar wasn't just a place to hide. It was a place where Silas stored his tools. As Vane pulled the door open, a flash of blue silk didn't come out. Instead, a heavy iron pitchfork, stored leaning against a ladder, was thrust upward with the last of a desperate woman's strength. The tines didn't kill him, but they caught Vane in the thigh, deep and jagged. He screamed, a high-pitched sound that didn't belong to a hero of Malpaso. He fell backward, his revolver firing wildly into the ceiling. Silas didn't wait. He was on Vane in a heartbeat. He didn't use a gun. He used his hands. The hands that had spent 15 years breaking rock and pulling stumps. He pinned Vane to the floor. The war's over, Julian, Silas hissed, his face inches from Vane's. And you're not a colonel anymore. You're just a man who's lost his way. Outside, the remaining deputies, seeing their boss down and hearing his screams, did what cowards always do when the fight turns real. They found their horses and rode into the black. They weren't paid enough to die for a broken man's pride. Cabin went quiet. Silas stood up, his chest heaving. He reached down into the cellar. It's okay, he said. He can't hurt you. Clara climbed out. She was covered in dust. Her hands were raw. She looked at Vane, who was clutching his leg and moaning on the floor. She didn't look afraid anymore. The terror had been burned away by the act of fighting back. She looked at the pitchfork, then at Silas. He won't stop, she whispered. He'll send others. He has a badge. He has the money. Silas looked at the man on the floor. He looked at the badge that had fallen off Vane's coat. Let him try, Silas said. There's a sheriff 2 towns over who owes me his life, and he hates marshals even more than I do. We're going to take Julian on a little ride. We're going to tell the truth about what happened in Tennessee. And what happened to you? The rest of the night was a blur of movement. Silas bandaged Vane's leg, not out of kindness, but to make sure he lived long enough to stand trial. He saddled the horses. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the Montana peaks, they rode out, Silas in the lead, Clara beside him, and the great Colonel Julian Vane tied to his thoroughbred like a sack of grain. The wind was still blowing. It was still cold, but as Silas Thorne looked at the horizon, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt clean. They reached the sheriff's office 3 days later. It turns out Clara hadn't just run away. She had a ledger, a small book she'd hidden under her dress, filled with Vane's true dealings, the bribes, the land thefts, the names of the men he'd killed to build his empire. Justice in the West is a slow thing. It's like a wagon stuck in the mud. But once it starts moving, nothing can stop it. Vane was stripped of his badge. The hero was revealed to be a thief. He died in a prison cell in Yuma 2 years later. Clara didn't go back to the city. She stayed in Montana. Not at the cabin. She'd had enough of hiding. She bought a small house in town and started teaching. They say she still has a look in her eyes, though. A look that says she'll never be property again. And Silas? He went back to his patch of dirt. He fixed the window. He put the bearskin rug back over the cellar door. But sometimes, on a quiet evening when the coffee is hot and the wind is low, he sits on his porch and looks toward the town. He realized that day that you can't run